So this workshop is, in my view, at the core of what this conference really is about. I guess I should start by saying my name is Sarah Chase, and I'm the moderator, and I'm just going to offer a little bit of introduction to the topic before I introduce our panelists. So this topic, in my view, really is core to the overall topic of this conference because, and it's become evident already in everything we've been hearing over the last couple of days, but we are not talking corruption in terms of one individual scandal over here or over there. What we're really talking about is the operating system of sophisticated networks. And that also means, again, the title of this workshop is state capture. But even that terminology almost sounds like you have somebody outside who comes in and grabs the state. And I don't actually think that's what we're talking about. I think what we're talking about here is the operating system of sophisticated networks that interweave public sector actors, private sector actors, out-and-out criminal actors, and often the individuals who are members of these networks switch places. They may be in government for a few years, then they come out into the private sector, that's how the network sort of weaves its fabric. These networks are dynamic. They're often disrupted by internal rivalries, right? Which make them look competitive and make them look often under the guise of political or ethnic tensions. And yet, fundamentally, they are furthering common interests. And those common interests are what? Enriching their members. Period, often at the expense, usually, almost always, at the expense of their citizens, to the point that, in fact, often they are looting their own citizens in order to enrich themselves. And I'd like to pause just one moment, again, on vocabulary. We've often heard words like special interests or private interest, or forces, things like that. Those are rather impersonal words, right? Let's remember these networks are made up of human beings. These are people who have human interactions and also therefore can be prosecuted, ideally, and in fact, not just, quote, held accountable, but actually punished. Again, let's get straight about what we mean by some of this vocabulary. And the other thing I think is really important to remember about these networks is that they are aggressive, creative, clever, in their self-defense. And we will be speaking about pitfalls in how these networks are addressed, how we're all trying to challenge them. But one of them, I think, is that we often underestimate how skillful they are in protecting themselves, in fighting back against any challenge, how creative they can be. Two last small points. Again, back to the theme of this conference. In my view, state capture or systemic corruption underlies every crisis besetting the globe today, from hot wars to mass migration to the unspeakable trauma that we are inflicting on this earth of ours. And I'm actually thrilled to see how much environmental focus there's been at the IACC this year. And therefore, this work is urgent. I mean, it's really urgent. I think Simon Taylor really impressed that upon us at the last plenary. And that means that these people with whom I share the stage, and you, You know, I mean, you're heroes. You are doing the most important work, in my view, that could be done at this juncture in our lives as human societies. So with that, I'd like to briefly introduce this terrific group of people. I'm going to go around and introduce everyone, and then we'll start what ideally is going to be a little bit more of a conversation than a series of presentations. So first, I'd like to speak about Eddie Garcia, who is, you're an indigenous person, are you not?
Yes, yeah. I am.
And that, I think, is beautiful to have here because, again, of the nexus that we have seen between indigenous people defending their land and indigenous people holding the corrupt, challenging the corrupt. You represented the victims of corruption in the healthcare system. Is that not right? Yeah,
yes,
that was a huge scandal in Guatemala. And Eddie is Guatemalan. And then legal aid for other victims of corruption. And now you're the executive director of the Presidential Commission on Open and Electronic Government in the new government of Guatemala.
Yes,
right?
it is. Yes.
Then we have Grzegorz Makowski. You're a sociologist, right?
Yes.
Sociologist at the Warsaw School of Economics. I'm very much in favor of bringing the human dimension into economic thinking.
We are just a small department.
I'm sure you are, but you know,
but still,
it doesn't take a majority to upset the apple cart. So. And then the Public Integrity Program, that was your last role, the director of the Public Integrity Program at the Stefan Batory Foundation.
Yes.
Great. And in fact, I just got us out of order already. Nadi. But it's because I sat us down already out of order. Nadi, so Transparency International Sri Lanka. You know what fascinates me about your background is from my understanding, stop me if I'm wrong, it was a sense of empathy with victims that drove you into the law. Is that correct?
Yes, and then drove me into the non-governmental sector.
Yeah. So, you know, lawyers get a bad reputation, but sometimes people enter that field for very good reasons. And in fact, in that position, you were really focused on human rights rather than specifically corruption initially, right? Is that true?
Before coming into TISL?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, yes.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly. So in particular, child abuse, victims of police violence, and quite quickly, we discover that human rights is also one of the crises that is engendered and driven by systemic corruption. It's a tool used by the corrupt, is the physical abuse of victims. And Henny, Director of Open Secrets, which has, as a number, I think, of allied organizations, focuses on three prongs in South Africa: investigations, strategic litigation, and advocacy. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And I urge you all to look at Open Secrets' website. The publications I found really extraordinary. They're South Africa focused, and yet you'll be struck by both the range and the specificity, the detail of the investigations. Also a TI alum. Not surprising that there's a lot of TI, you know, adjacent people. So I sort of gave a general overview of how I see, how I understand state capture. But like all of these phenomena, there are amazing, I think, patterns that strikingly repeat themselves from country to country to country to country. And yet, of course, certain manifestations will be a little bit different in different countries. So I've asked everyone to just give us a sense of so Eddie, what does state capture look like in Guatemala?
Okay. Well, Guatemala, in Guatemala, we are in historical time right now. And we are facing a state capture, but criminal redes.
Networks, criminal networks?
Yes. Yes. And we are facing the next level of state capture.
Right.
Is a reconfiguration of the state capture. And for example, Guatemala has been a reference in the fight against corruption, because in Guatemala there was an agency, international CC, fight corruption and impunity. But after, with the next governments, that changed, and
there was a backsliding. There was a backsliding. So I'm just going to clarify a little bit. Guatemala's at a historic juncture right now because there's a new government. In the past, it was a reference, right, on anti-corruption because of the International Anti-Corruption Commission that was working there, the CICIG. Then there was a sudden backsliding.
Yes. Yes, and an authoritarian regime was consolidated in the last years that used the executive power and punitive power to prosecute to anti-corruption activists, to journalists, to official attorney, for example, and the following repressive action stand out. One, criminalization via criminal justice against prosecutors and judges who brought high-impact cases against corrupt structures. Two, criminalization of anti-corruption activists and journalists who denounced grand corruption. And reforms to the NGO law that sought to cancel organizations that criticize the regime. That is a futures of a state captures, I think so.
So it's a repurposing of the state, and you mentioned, you know, the sort of criminal networks, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. When I say sophisticated kleptocratic networks, it almost always includes criminal strands in the networks. And then Eddie was talking about the prosecution of the prosecutors, and that's also something that Simon Taylor mentioned had gone on, but in Milan, in that case, over a case involving Nigerian oil. Nadi, would you be so kind as to, and I have to confess, I don't know, as I have some familiarity with Guatemala, but not as much with Sri Lanka. So are there elements there that sound familiar to you?
Yes.
So when we work with people and we have to simply define state capture, I'll start with that. What I use as the working definition is, see, it is one thing to have a kleptocracy ruled by thieves, in simple words. Ruled by thieves is what thieves. Yeah. Sorry, it sounds harsh, but that's the easiest definition of kleptocracy. But to say that they capture the state is another meaning. That is when laws and policies can be passed just to benefit a few people at the cost of the entire nation. They can be changed, they can be brought in. Then you are captured. This country is bringing in laws. You don't know for whom. I mean, you can see who benefits, but it doesn't help the people. So Sri Lanka is in this position, and I'm sad that I had to come here and say this. But we have a parliament that no longer represents us. It has been captured by the executive. We have a very powerful executive presidency by design in the constitution. And right now, they are like a tool that just lifts the hands, whatever the executive says. So, we fear any bill going to parliament because the government has a majority and it gets passed. And Sri Lanka does not have judicial review of legislation. We only have judicial review of bills. bills. And we are given 14 days to do that, and they make sure that these bills are gazetted and put in the order paper just before a long holiday, public holiday, court vacation. It's just so manipulative. It's purposely done, and in the last couple of months, I mean, I would say last year or two, this government, which has been rolling out a lot of laws, one after the other, saying that it is even part of the IMF agreement. As you would know, Sri Lanka faced its worst economic crisis in 2022. We declared bankruptcy, but there was also an unprecedented people's uprising out there in the street, a peaceful protest, which continued, persisted until the president stepped down. But the government remained, and this current president just came through a constitutional sort of a place that nobody knew that. So it's not like he's an elected president. The election is due this year. And in that little space where we negotiated our 17th IMF agreement, I think we should be ashamed, and the IMF should be ashamed to give a loan.
What agreement?
The International Monetary Fund. We've gone there for the 17th time.
17th.
So obviously we are not doing any sustainable efforts in terms of the debt we have been given. And I think the international financial institutions need to question that, including the World Bank and the ADB, on whom we greatly depend for decades. So however, in this phase of time, we are rolling out these laws. They are called online safety bill. There's nothing safe about it. It has, for example, it has defined, it has given a power to this authority appointed by the president to dictate what we should post on Facebook, on WhatsApp, whether it offends the government. And they even passed it against the Supreme Court. We went to Supreme Court. It was the petition that got most amount of cases filed to challenge it. Supreme Court came up with a whole list of essential amendments to make it constitutional. For the first time, the parliament did not adhere to those amendments, and the speaker signed in a bill that was against the Supreme Court. You're violating the constitution, and what can we do? Nothing, because after all, that's our parliament. We are in a captured state. In addition, I'll give one more example why I say the state is, we have state capture in Sri Lanka. Public procurement, purchasing of goods and services for the government. It is a high-risk area for corruption, as we all know. Now, they have manipulated the system so that it's rigged from the beginning. We have a national guideline. We have a procedure even for unsolicited bids, but we do not follow it in a uniform way. And for example, now we know there has to be a technical committee to evaluate a proposal. Say it's a highway, or it has a technical side to it. The committee would be drafting the specification in such a way that the bid can only go to certain suppliers. I mean, it's so captured, and actually massive agreements divesting very valuable resources. Sri Lanka is rich with natural resources, geographically in an extremely great spot where everybody loves us: China, India, United States, everyone. But we are divesting our resources, and sometimes only the minister knows that that agreement was signed. It was not debated in parliament. Forget about talking to the people who are going to get evicted or anything. So basically, I can go on, but have I taken more time?
I think, as we try to look at a general picture of this, we're looking at the repurposing of the instruments of state function to serve the purposes of the network at the expense of the population. So we've heard from Eddie, justice function. Every country I've looked at kleptocratic country I've looked at wants to capture and weaponize the justice function. Occasionally it doesn't work. Occasionally you have a relatively independent justice function, in which case the network will work around. Sisi's Egypt, I remember, basically change the jurisdiction of a whole bunch of cases so that they would go through army courts rather than the relatively independent civilian courts. And then we have the power of the pen, right? That's the power of the scales, and that's the power of the pen legislation. So the power to write the rules is always going to be a key objective of a kleptocratic network. Grzegorz?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't be an academician if I wouldn't question a little bit state capture, which I mean the term I don't like so much, but I prefer grand corruption. But I don't want to go to the discussion on definitions. But so let's stay by the state capture. But listening to you, in case of Poland, I mean the first similarity is. In case of Poland, it was the same. I mean, the first attack of the government and the ruling majority after elections in 2015, because I speak about the period between 2015 and 2023, was attack on the Constitutional Court and the judiciary and the prosecution. So just in half of a year, the Constitutional Court was paralyzed. The common judiciary was taken over.
Paralyzed? What do you mean paralyzed?
Because, I mean, the new appointed judges to the Constitutional Court were very close and very politicized, very close to the ruling party. So step by step during the year, I mean, the whole Constitutional Court was simply captured. And what you say, I mean, in Sri Lanka, maybe you don't have constitutional control of the law that is adopted, but I mean, in the situation like we had in Poland, it doesn't help, because when you take over Constitutional Court, then you can pass any law that is unconstitutional, and in the end of the day say that this is constitutional. And this is different to what happened in Hungary, for example, because in that case, Hungarians simply elected the party that had the constitutional majority, and Viktor Orban basically could change the constitution and do all the reforms against the rule of law and introduce and implement or corruption-generating institutions lawfully, basically. So in Poland, many changes happened, let's say, against the constitution, but there was no one, aside of civil society experts, academicians, who could question constitutionality of this legal infrastructure that was being developed after elections in 2015. So this is one thing, and maybe one more thing I would mention is the result of all of it, because when you have the power centralized on the side of the executive, and the executive can do anything, they can propose any bill and they can pass, anything in the parliament, because parliament stopped to be a place where you discuss what is the quality of the law and the purpose of the law and so on. I mean, the parliament became just a machine of voting what the government
a rubber stamp.
Yeah, and to speed the process, we started. I mean, Poland, the government started using a very interesting technique. I mean, it's known in other countries. They started to put the governmental bills as MP bills, just to speed up the process and avoid the consultations and the discussions. So they were able to adopt the law very important, just in 20 hours or something. I mean, the fastest adopted law in this period, 2015-2023, it took them like 2 hours, you know, to adopt. So you can imagine how did it look like. And just to say, I mean, the result was predictable, you know, because when you control everything, then you can use other state resources for the party purposes, particularistic purposes, like funds, government funds to feed, you know, electoral campaigns, public television, public media. I mean, they stopped to be public media; they became a governmental media by in the end of the day. And I will...
Can I ask you to slow down just a little bit? Slow down your speaking.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
And just to end, well, I have just 5 minutes, you know, for the first part. So this is because of all of this. But just to end my first intervention is to say that in the end of the day, it reminds quite classical, let's say, mechanisms. I don't want to compare Poland to the fail of the Weimar Republic and the birth of the Third Reich, but because it wasn't the totalitarian system. I mean, it was very close to the authoritarian system. It was closing and closing, but the mechanism was classical. I mean, if you want to capture the state, capture constitutional court, capture common judiciary, then the prosecution, and then you can do anything from the level of the executive. And I think it repeats everywhere, I mean, the same scheme.
Just 2 questions or 2 thoughts I'll put in. One is, it looks like we're looking at 2 windows of opportunity countries. And we might want to talk about that in the next round. Because you are saying up to 2023, you also had an election, a very important election in 2023. And I'd like to say a few words about this idea of window of opportunity, because I think it's crucial in terms of how we all marshal our resources to capture moments. But the other thing I'll just ask, I haven't heard anyone yet, and we're going to get to Henny in a second, but I haven't heard anyone speak about the capture of the instruments of force. I know that was crucial in Guatemala, yeah?
Yeah. The power of the
army.
Punitive power.
Yeah.
Used for personal interests.
Army in particular, or also police?
Police, the security forces, yes.
How about Poland? Was that part of that state capture project?
Yeah, of course, especially special services. And they were, let's say, the crucial instrument for the ruling party, you know, to control themselves as well as also opposition. Interesting position was the position of the army, which I think kept the independence to much extent. Police, yes, it was politicized, but it wasn't so much instrumentalized for the purposes of keeping in power. But the special services, it was the important element.
Often it's specific units within army or police.
May I just say a word? I mean, probably the most controversial special service at that time was this Central Anti-Corruption Bureau, which was the most politicized and is, unfortunately. I know there are friends from the Anti-Corruption Bureau here, and they served for years, so I'm sorry to say, but from this point of view, from the analytical point of view, I'm sorry that Central Anti-Corruption Bureau was the worst case in this.
And in Sri Lanka, was that also, were the security services or any branch of them?
The police is a problem. And the recently appointed Inspector General of Police is a person convicted of torture. And there was a case filed by many people went to court challenging him being appointed as acting IGP. And then they went ahead nevertheless. using the Constitutional Council, which is the independent commission in charge of all key high-level appointments in Sri Lanka, which still, unfortunately, has a majority representation of the government members, and also because the speaker tends to act like he belongs to a party. So yeah, I mean, I don't feel, like people have told me in the recent past, due to some incidents, why don't you lodge a police complaint? And me and my husband were like, are you crazy? No. Yeah. I mean, why should I cannot. And that's not a good situation to be.
No, where the police is hostile to your interests. And that may have been part of what took you from whatever, police misconduct to corruption, yeah? Henny. What does it look like now? You may not just be looking at South Africa only, but either South or Southern Africa, and maybe, you know, who else is, how far do these networks extend?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. You know, I'm reminded that the state capture period in South Africa ran for about 7 or 8 years and ended in 2018, 2019. So we're a 30-year-old democracy. A new president was inaugurated after a peaceful election today, this afternoon. And it was a very important election because what happened is two important things. One is that the governing African National Congress lost its majority for the very first time, so the Party of Liberation that liberated South Africa with a much broader civil society movement from apartheid. And two important elements of that is, one, that the party that peeled off and broke away from the ANC is really the party that represents the beneficiaries of state capture within government who are now outside of government. So the former president, Jacob Zuma, and his party, and they got 15% of the vote. And of course, the far bigger constituency of South Africans who've been turned off by democracy have stopped voting. So we had the lowest turnout in our democratic history.
Can I ask what the percentage was? Of voters or non-voters?
So we had about 13 million people who voted out of a voting age population of about 45 million.
Ooh, so you're
that
saying
gives
like
you
about a quarter?
Roughly.
Roughly a quarter.
So of the registered number of voters, about 50% voted, but the majority of South Africans didn't, you know, the voting age didn't register. So in real terms, we have a shrinking interest in democracy. And I guess, Sarah, you know, listening to everybody's contributions, I think from our perspective, it's really important to understand that these are the legacies of state capture.
Sorry, the what?
The legacies of state capture.
The legacies
so you have these individuals who remain active in our society precisely because there's a culture of impunity that has developed. But that culture of impunity was part of the logic of state capture. And you know, listening to colleagues, I think immediately after we came out of, you know, Zuma was removed from office, the political head of the South African government.
So I'll just say potential third window of opportunity, right, in South Africa.
Sure. But in this period, about 2018, 2019, South Africans were quite punch drunk. They didn't understand what just happened. For 5 years, the state effectively, it was very clear, had taken on a completely different function. From delivering the needs of the majority of the country's people, we suddenly woke up to the realization that there was a corrupt group of cronies, business people from India who had settled in South Africa, who worked very closely with President Jacob Zuma and his family in appropriating the state. And the South African now Chief Justice, Raymond Zondo, sat for a period of about 2.5 years and led a commission into state capture in South Africa. So our understanding of what's going on is based on the analysis that's been done. Hundreds of witnesses were called, $50 million spent on the commission, a 900-page report is produced. And I mean, it's a clunker, and it describes, importantly, the various areas. Maybe I can just talk to that briefly, if I can, Sarah, of where this capture specifically took place. Because it was a political project within the governing African National Congress.
Sorry, what project?
A political project within the governing African National Congress, led by Zuma and his cabal and his clique on the one side. But it functioned primarily through South Africa's state-owned enterprises. Right. So the the commission responsible for providing energy, so that's centralized in South Africa to date, providing railroad infrastructure, providing commuter train infrastructure, the South African Airways, the national airline, the revenue authorities, a range of other state-owned enterprises, the broadcasting, the national public broadcaster, where there were clearly, there was clear evidence that this commission showed that the purpose was to appropriate control over every one of these huge cash cows through which government money runs, and then re-divert that cash off to a whole range of cronies. And that was a calculated process, is what we can show in South Africa. It would change the entire function of the state from delivering to the interest of working for the interests of poor and working class people, marginalized people primarily, which is the primary constituency, to effectively enriching a group of pretty well-connected, wealthy people. Some of that took, and Sarah, your point is an important one around rewriting the rules. And so the rewriting of the rules in South Africa was not necessarily done as effectively by the legislature as by multinational consulting companies. So in this instance, this is where McKinsey and Bain from the United States were brought in. And I must say, they weren't only brought in, Bain and McKinsey helped orchestrate a process of looting in the state-owned enterprises. So they went, Bain, for example, went to the head, to Zuma, met with him in private on a number of occasions, and put forward a proposal that they would effectively destroy the revenue authority's ability to collect taxes from large corporations. And of course, that meant if you can't collect from large corporations, you can't collect from well-connected, corrupt individuals who are making a fortune as well.
And that's what I mean by collective interests.
Absolutely. And so you have these boys from Chicago sitting down with corrupt network in South Africa and a family from India, and they see this amazing opportunity to pilfer. And that is precisely what Bain did with the Revenue Authority. McKinsey assisted in the destruction of South Africa's Electricity Supply Commission, the state-owned electricity utility, and our state-owned railway network, which was is still in terms of size the biggest in Africa, but none of the trains run on time. We've had, the ability for we aren't able to move goods to the country's ports any longer because of the way in which this institution was destroyed. Now, these companies were quite central.
Can I ask you also just to slow down a little bit?
So these companies were effectively really, as I said, responsible for rewriting the rules in many ways. And we saw this happening right across the
Did this then have to go through Parliament, or could these be promulgated by executive order?
Yeah, so much of this would be done in structuring the way in which the state-owned enterprises undertook their procurement. So it wasn't a question, when I say rewriting the rules, it's really about ensuring that the way in which they procure, particular big acquisitions would work in such a way to favor particular individuals. And of course, some of this we now only know after the fact, right? It wasn't necessarily a case that we knew about all of this at the time. But that also points to the overall role that the private enablers played, because in South Africa, our understanding of state capture is it's the role of the state and of private enablers, of private corporations. And we can talk a little bit more about HSBC, the big banks that were involved in state capture in South Africa, the big auditing companies, KPMG, PwC, Deloitte. All of these are named by the Chief Justice in his company as being central to a project to destroy the democratic state in South Africa. That's the way I would summarize it. He wouldn't quite call it that, but that's effectively what their project was.
Can I ask one more question about that? And this may seem a little bit too specific, but would you consider those companies as simply guns for hire? That is to say, just selling their services? Or would you actually say that to some extent, maybe local branches or whatever were actually, you would consider them to be interwoven into the kleptocratic network itself?
Well, yeah, they are the kleptocratic network. It isn't an interwovenness, again, suggests that there is this corrupt government, and then you have this strange relationship with the enabler. And we're coming, I think at this conference, we're coming closer to talking about an architecture of corruption, but there's still a great hesitancy to say,
thank you.
Actually, this is a system that we're facing in our countries.
Yeah, absolutely.
May I just add very short, because I think you raise very important points about the role of the business and international business in, let's say, keeping the state captured, let's say. Because during all these 8 years in Poland, at least from my point of view, I had only, let's say, one discussion with this international business about what is going on in this country. I remember, there will be a very short anecdote. At one point, I think 2017, so it was already, the system was quite mature already. Everything was taken. We had a visit in my organization, Stefan Batory Foundation, of a group of very prominent representatives of financial institutions, banks, insurance institutions, and so on. And director or something like this was the only meeting of this kind I've ever had in my life. Big fish, visited me. And they tried to, we spoke about the condition of democracy, rule of law, and corruption, and so on and so on. They were just, listening to what I was complaining on. And in the end of this meeting, I asked them, okay, so what do you think about, all this situation that we have in country? Will it impact, your engagement in the business in the country? And they told me quite honestly that no, it's the worst what can happen is the permanent people on the streets. This is what they are really scared about. People on the streets. If there are too much people on the streets, too long protests, then this might be a problem. And when you were speaking about this engagement of these consulting companies and law companies, I started thinking that we speak a lot about corporate social responsibility, but I never heard about something like corporate democratic responsibility. Maybe we should start discussing something like this.
Or corporate criminal responsibility.
Yeah, that too. And I think what Hene has just said is really important, because there is a growing, I think, appreciation of, quote, the role of, quote, enablers. I have an issue also with that word, because when you look at Deloitte and McKinsey and things like that, who is in the United States government right now, but often graduates of those companies. And so what I'm trying to say is that it's a little too easy to sort of say, oh, the ugly banks, oh, the real estate agents, and we're still keeping that, we're still not quite facing, as you say, the fact of an architecture of corruption, even in a place like the United States. I find Americans are a little bit more willing to talk about our enablers. We're not so willing to concede that our judiciary is being captured just the same way the Guatemalan judiciary is being captured, and I could go on. But why don't we now turn, and I know the typical thing to do is, oh, but, what cause for encouragement is there? I think we need to be quite level-headed and say, let's call this, what lessons, Eddie, have you learned about this moment of transition in Guatemala? And I want to ask you a couple of things in that regard, if you can, and I know you've had some thoughts, but I'd like to put a couple of specifics to you. One is, I know that you are the Open and Electronic Government Director. Is transparency enough? Or what else, is transparency in support of other ways of reforming, what has been a kleptocratic government. And also, you mentioned CICIG, which achieved some amazing prosecutorial successes. I also think that, again, that's part of why Guatemala was such an example for everyone else. I mean, I'd love to see some Americans in jail, both from the private and the public sector. What has been the benefit of those successful prosecutions? And is that enough? Or what else is needed? And do you consider this to be a window of opportunity?
Thank you for the question. First, the transparency is not enough. We need to face the kleptocratic networks and identify that kleptocratic networks who support the capture of the justice, for example, or another institution, and other forms of power. We need to identify that networks, create a legal framework, regulation, democratic, to, for example, the private sector. In Guatemala, the private sector have too much power, and they support to the general attorney, for example, Consuelo Porras, who is a world corruption person declared to many countries, European Union, United States, and other countries, and he, after of the big mobilizations in Guatemala, for example, for the indigenous people who defended democracy, lasted 106 days, paralyzed all the country, and an incredible movement. But still, the general attorney is still in his position right now.
Today, the Attorney General.
Because the support of the kleptocratic networks. And right now, in this new government, we are working with the danger of the prosecution of this general attorney who instrumentalizes the criminal justice.
You're working on prosecuting the Attorney General, or you're working in fear of being prosecuted? In fear of being prosecuted by?
Yes.
Yeah, so why are you head of the Transparency and Electronic Government Commission and you're not Attorney General? Like, why are you not Attorney General? Why is he still in his position?
Because he has the support of the kleptocratic networks. Is that how this group of persons instrumentalizing the power, and what is the most power on the countries is the criminal justice, the punitive power, and another instruments who they use to maintain his privilege.
So this is really interesting. You're saying even after an upset election, which brought into power a reformist government,
yes,
still the old network is so powerful that it's impossible to remove the Attorney General?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is impressive. I think it's I don't know. But I think in the anti-corruption community have to work on face these kleptocratic networks, for example. For example, in Latin America, the kleptocratic networks used to justice for maintain his power, his privilege. And I think we explored the forms to face this form of exercise of power. And on the second question, I think the criminal justice is not enough. It's not enough. We have many lessons in Guatemala, and when the criminal justice is capture, we don't have a development, we don't have a true fight against corruption, and we need to fight corruption and integrally ways.
Integrally.
Sorry for my English.
Yeah, no. I'm not correcting your English. I'm emphasizing what you said. So what I'm hearing there, and I suspect that we're going to hear more about it. Nadi may chime in here, but is that we really need we're dealing with multi-strand networks, and that requires multi-pronged, I think, challenges to them. So we need transparency. We need some people to go to jail. I think I heard you saying, Eddie, we need civic mobilization and really persistent civic mobilization. And I think what I heard you say is that we need, reforms once one of the metaphors I like to use for these networks is the Hydra. The Hydra from Greek myth was this creature that you cut one head off and two more grow. I think that's kind of what we're up against. And it's a beautiful metaphor because in the myth, Hercules himself could not defeat the Hydra alone. He needed his cousin with him who cauterized the neck. So Hercules would cut off the head and then his cousin would cauterize the neck so another head couldn't grow. And I think that may be the role of the reform legislation and practices and things like that. But I think Nadi has a little bit more specifics on the types of different efforts that need to happen at the same time, no?
Yes, and while we're talking about the judiciary being part of the captured institutions, in Sri Lanka, it is at the moment also part of the solution. Now, it is not that they are without intimidation. In Parliament, in other forums, the President himself has made intimidating remarks a couple of days before the Supreme Court is supposed to give a very important judgment, saying things like, this is not a matter for court, this is a matter for legislature. So it's not that, and we would not know what kind of pressures and threats they face. However, so there are situations where the Supreme Court has, what we say, thrown out cases. They don't even give you leave to proceed. But there are very important landmark decisions that the court has given. TISL been there for 20 years in Sri Lanka, and in the last year and up to now, we've filed many cases because we feel that out of the many things we do, from community awareness to advocacy to lots of things, filing cases on grand corruption scandals and to challenge unconstitutional bills, these have been impactful. One I would like to mention is when we went to court, Supreme Court, seeking accountability for the economic crisis. There were a few other petitioners. We did a lot of public communication, and I like to bring this point that at the end of the day, judges are also human beings like us, and they have families. They need to be able to give a judgment and go home and face their family. So one thing is that it's the point that we had to parallelly work with the people so that there is a grand momentum at ground level demanding justice. And through the darkness that came with the economic crisis, bankruptcy, the silver lining was the people's uprising and what we call the social awakening about the evils of corruption, grand corruption, and how it affects my bread and butter. Normal, average citizen figured that out. That became their slogan on the street. Bring back stolen assets. They were holding boards. We want a system change was the main slogan. Businesses, we've been trying hard to work with them, and they like to say that they had nothing to do with corruption. However, they also realized that, because they used to think that as long as we pay these institutions and look after ourselves, we can survive. When the economy crashed, they realized that that does not work. If the country crashes, we all crash. So we had Sri Lanka Institute of Directors, International Chamber of Commerce, these institutions reaching out to TISL and saying, it's time the private sector takes concrete action to look at our corruption vulnerabilities, stand up against corruption because we are main colluders. So this happened. And with this momentum, each time we file a case, we do a press release. We simplify what the point is to the people, and we give it to media. When we get media appearances, we talk about it. And then the judgment was landmark, where the Supreme Court in Sri Lanka held that the former president, prime minister, finance minister, central bank governor, and the monetary board were in fact accountable for the economic crisis because a series of decisions that they took from about a year before the final crashing of the economy were not taken in the best interest of the public. And the words they used was that you did not respect the public trust doctrine, that you hold power, you hold public resources in trust for the people of Sri Lanka. You're not the owners, you're the trustees, and you did not keep that trust. It's a very high-level accountability, which will have a deterrent effect on those public officials and politicians taking power now. And also, we've gone to court and received interim orders on health sector corruption. We've lost lives. Recently, people have been injected with something which they thought was a medicine, which was nothing. It was not even water, it was something that killed people. We have these health sector procurement scandals, and we've gone to court on this. These cases are coming up. There was an interim order given to stop further procurement. And I think these cases give people hope. And also we've been able to stall some bad laws, like the microfinance bill, which is supposed to come to protect the victims of microfinance. These are the normal low-income holding families, the ladies, from the predators of microfinance companies who often engage in sextortion, where the bill was drafted with one section exempting big companies from liability. It was like, what's the whole point? And the Supreme Court held with us, and they withdrew the bill. And we have gone to court on the public financial management bill, which is part of the IMF agreement. There was one section that has been put in under our law. I'm not supposed to say right now because the order has to come from the court what it should be, but our concern was the clause that gave power to the minister to exempt certain state-owned enterprises from following the national procurement guidelines. I mean, what's the whole point of strengthening public financial management? And I would like to say that one more thing that we did, I think others can take something from, is bringing civil society together. We came together to do like a shadow governance diagnostic to kind of challenge the IMF's governance diagnostic, which they did for Sri Lanka, which we were not happy with the framework they were using. But this is a golden opportunity. The elections are coming up this year and next year, presidential, parliamentary. Government is weak. They are dependent on IMF, World Bank, ADB, and bilaterals for survival. If these agreements will entail essential anti-corruption governance reforms, although there's absolutely no political will, they'll be compelled to take some of these systemic reforms seriously and get done. This is our one chance to address the problem of state capture by fixing the system, by fixing the gaps where systemic corruption creeps in, to strengthen parliamentary oversight, to come up with a solid framework of open procurement. So we wanted the anti-corruption reform agenda clearly spelled out, telling people what it means means, the system change should mean. And now we have two beautiful documents which are very complementing the civil society governance diagnostic and the IMF's one. And there we got many other civil society organizations to tie hands with TISL. They were not working on corruption. They were working on other areas. They all said human rights, environment, children, women. We realize if you don't address corruption, we cannot achieve this. So we stand with you.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing in both of these places, I just want to again emphasize, we're talking cross-cutting coalitions, right? Is that cross-cutting coalitions of ordinary people was the same thing in Guatemala, because what these networks are trying to do is split us apart from each other along identity lines, and be that gender, be it race, be it who's the biggest victim, be it political orientation. Once that's achieved, we're going to lose. But what you're telling me is that you were able to weave together. And then the other thing that's very interesting that you raised, Nadi, is sometimes, so we've got the Bains and all of those guys, but sometimes the international or multilateral institutions can be allies. And that's where reformers on the ground in countries that do receive absolutely existentially necessary support from the IMF or whatever, then alliances need to be made between groups on the ground and those organizations saying, be tough on our government, please. Is that kind of what you're saying?
It sounds bad that I am asking for conditionality.
Right.
Right? And
right.
We've had this debate among some youth. And I was like, well, that happens in state capture. My government isn't listening to me. They are only listening to the IMF, World Bank, and the donors because, again, they have to. They don't have a choice. So I am telling them what to demand. I mean, these are coming from the ground.
Right.
This system changes. And I'm telling them what you're putting is not good enough. And if you don't talk about governance, you're not going to achieve economic recovery. What we have now in Sri Lanka is economic plastering.
Right.
Wound is not healed.
Right. Grzegorz.
I mean, you stopped on the international organizations, and I think in case of Poland, this was one of the factors very important in terms of, let's say, overcoming the state capture. And I think the most important role played the European Commission, the pressure from the European Commission and the conditionality mechanism. I mean, maybe it's not totally effective, but still, it was something really important. Another important international institution was the Council of Europe and the Venice Convention.
Wow, really?
Yeah, and the Venice Convention was very important, Greek group against corruption. But I want to say 2 words about the mobilization and the cooperation across different groups, different communities, because I agree, this is important, but at least my observation, and I think our experience from Poland, is that it's not enough. I mean, you may have a strong organization, even still independent under state capture. You may have, from time to time, people on the streets, but I think what really saved us in the end of the day, in 2023, was the cooperation also between the opposition parties.
Yeah.
And cooperation with them, cooperation inside the opposition, let's say, community, this brought the real result. But
But you are still talking about a cross-cutting cooperation among what had been somewhat competitive.
But you said about the ordinary people. I mean, I treat politicians not the ordinary.
You're adding,
you have to have these politicians, you know, because who has the money? I mean, to compete with the ruling party. I mean, only these politicians that still are in their seats. But I want to say one more thing, because you won't have a civil society mobilization, if there won't be an awareness, how important
awareness?
Awareness. Yes, sorry. And may I just? I will show you just two slides, if I may ask you.
Quickly, if I may ask you, because I've let us go a little bit longer.
So this is a very general question that is asked for years in Poland about the assessment.
Oh yeah, this is interesting.
Assessment of how important corruption is for the ordinary people. I mean, the question answers. I mean, the darkest area is. Are those who think that the corruption is very big. Look.
And it's gone down.
It's going down. It's going down. And we started in 2000, let's say, I don't have an indicator from 2015, but it's going down. I mean, people don't care so much, you know, about corruption, despite that corruption is becoming systemic.
Right.
And look at this. I mean, this is the national parliament voting intention. I mean, look, I mean, the only... Well, I don't have a laser, but the only change that happened since between 2015 and 2023 was the October. Look a little bit on this graph. The blue graph is the ruling party. October 20 is the moment where they started losing support. But it wasn't because of corruption. It wasn't because of the state capture. It was because of the sentence of the taken over constitutional court banning abortion. That was the factor. I mean, and between 2015 and 2023, we had a lot of scandals. You know, every year there were dozen, not single scandals, dozen. And fortunately, we had free media still, which is also an important factor. But people simply didn't care. Because why? Why? My theory is because we were and we are in still quite good situation. I mean, economical situation, people are doing good, they have money. I mean, they look at this state capture as like a TV series, you know, there's this far from them, you know. They don't experience, you know, bribery at hospitals, bribery at schools. If they know politicians bribe themselves, it doesn't matter. And I want to come back to your point, because you know the lesson from Poland is also you have this prosecutor that he's still in place. We have still a constitutional court that is taken over. It's very big problem for this government that was formed after 2023. We have still president who is vetoing every single piece of legislation that could bring us back on the track of rule of law and dismantling this state capture that was built during these years. And what I want to say in the end is, if you are in this type of situation, when you are not totally ruined, when the economical situation is not so bad, people are not going to the streets, they don't stay there for long. I mean, it's very difficult to rebuild the rule of law and to get rid of the state capture, because at the same time, you also want to do it in a rule of law way, yes? So you just can't fire, you know, all judges from the Constitutional Court. You want to rebuild it, yes? You want to legitimize it. So it's much easier to rebuild or build from the scratch the democratic state, rule of law state, when everything is ruined. And in Poland we have this experience. 1989, it was total disaster of the communist system that was totally captured by the Communist Party for 50 years. But it simply collapsed. And, you know, in this situation, you can do everything from the scratch. But if you have a situation like we had, then I just remind you, these guys won elections, every elections since 2015. Presidential elections, European elections, parliamentary elections in 2019. And also they won elections in 2023 by percentage. But they didn't manage to get as many mandates as there were necessary to form the government. And we were simply, I don't believe in luck, but there was a coincidence of different factors, and the opposition opposition parties could form the coalition government. But they still have over 30% support. So this is not the end of the game.
No, and I think that point is a very important one for prosperous Western democracies that are being captured.
Yes, so Sarah, I mean, maybe I would differ from Gregos around the issue of watching television, because in South Africa, we know that up to 2 million people were driven into poverty as a result of state capture. So this is in addition to having an unemployment rate that wavers are between 35 and 40% of the population. So when we talk about the crime, the former President Jacob Zuma would often say, who are the victims? I see no victims, right? And I think we often hear this kind of refrain, and so they very clearly are victims. In South Africa, maybe just reflecting on some of the points that have been made, we were able to rely on an active civil society, and independent investigative journalists, members of the governing party who were prepared to speak out, and often speak out behind closed doors, people working within the public broadcaster, members of the media generally, and certain institutions that weren't captured. The Public Protector's Office, Thuli Madonsela is here. There's an example of brave civil servants, public servants rather, who were not captured in the process. So I think the important thing is, the point made as well, it's not, our experience wasn't one of a complete authoritarian, iron fist. It was still being contested. Would we be there now if all these forces in society didn't resist? I don't think so. And that took an independent judiciary that wasn't captured. But let me make 2 points. The firstly is what we did see, though, was we have an independent judiciary, and our prosecuting service is separate, is an independent authority. Part of the project, the state capture project in South Africa, was to defang and to destroy the prosecuting service. Now, it predated our current predicament. Just after the International Anti-Corruption Conference in Durban in 1999, Jacob Zuma closed that corruption conference, and within a week he was back in the city of Durban, and he was accepting a bribe from the French arms company Thales. This is after he got up and said to all the good anti-corruption fighters, we don't need laws to fight corruption, we should just send out the cops to arrest everybody. Within 2 weeks, he was taking money from Thales. And why was he taking money from Thales as a lowly politician? Because Thales, the French company, state-owned, bet on him. They said, we are going to do a corrupt deal with British companies and German companies and others. But your role is going to be to stop the authorities from being able to hold us to account. And so 10 years later, in 2009, Zuma is elected into office. And the first step of his project is to destroy the anti-corruption authority, the Scorpions. And so now they've been destroyed. What happens then is he ties in with this network, what we call the Gupta network, and the various corporate enablers. And for them to succeed, the next phase that needs to take place is that the general capacity of the state to tackle corruption must be hollowed out completely. Thank you very much. So for a period of about 10 or 11 years, 12 years, we have not seen the state and the prosecuting authority being able to effectively prosecute one case of complex economic crime. They've prosecuted many cases, and I'm glad they do. But they haven't, the high-level grand corruption has not been prosecuted, right? So you've basically destroyed the capacity. And now, even though there's a new reform-minded leaders, some of whom are in the audience here, we still haven't seen them in the last 3 or 4 years being able to prosecute one case. And unfortunately, they have fudged most of those cases. So what do we do? What is to be done, said Lenin. Well, here's the question. What do we do? If we aren't able to always deal, because of the paralysis that's been created in the state because of state capture, then surely we should be able to turn to our international partners to do the right thing. But what is the South African experience? And I really point this out because this isn't South Africa's experience. This is the global norm. T-Systems in Germany said they're going to investigate, no prosecution. Vossloh, who destroyed the commuter train system in Spain, and said they're going to investigate, no prosecution. Bain, no prosecution in the United States. McKinsey, no prosecution in the United States. And I'd like to use just one last example, if I may. And that's the example of the bank that was responsible for laundering the cash that was stolen in South Africa, the primary bank. Many banks were involved, domestic banks included. But the biggest of those banks was HSBC. based in London, operating in Hong Kong. We all know them, right? So HSBC was really created the architecture to funnel all the stolen cash out of South Africa into the world. And they did this through the United Arab Emirates, with well, certainly we believe, with the United Arab Emirates authorities knowing very well what was happening. And they later on protected the Gupta family from prosecution and prevented their arrest. They are now citizens of the island of Vanuatu. And this cash was then sent around the world to Hong Kong, etc. But in that process, the question remains why there hasn't been the prosecution of HSBC in China, certainly because they have control over the territory of Hong Kong. But we do know that Chinese rail companies were primary beneficiaries of corruption and had bribed South African officials, so that might explain why. Then when we turn to the United States, to the United Kingdom. So very briefly, let me just tease out something to you. The Bureau for Investigative Journalists in 2021 published, I think, a really seminal piece of investigation. And this really fed into this commission of inquiry into state capture in South Africa. And they showed that, they uncovered the fact that HSBC, so let's go back very briefly, HSBC in 2012 is slapped with a deferred prosecution agreement by the United States government. Why? HSBC is basically acting in the interests of the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. So they are forced to pay roughly $2 billion by the US authorities. This is 2012. In the period between 2014 and 2017, we now know that HSBC knew that there were 60 accounts that were moving about $4 billion around the world. Some of that was stolen money from South Africa, some of it was money from terror networks around the world, and other cash. There was an individual, so the way the deferred prosecution agreements work, which we are told are marvelous, the way it works is that the Department of Justice brings in a private company to look into this and to monitor effectively the implementation. Company's name is Exeger, who undertook this. The person who we know of who was working at Exeger at the time was the person by the name of Lisa Osofsky. Lisa Osofsky, shortly after this information is covered by HSBC. It's not reported to the Department of Justice. Where does Osofsky go? She heads the SFO, the primary anti-corruption agency in the United Kingdom.
The Serious Fraud Office.
And where is HSBC based, housed? It's in the United Kingdom. So now is the question we need to ask ourselves. Why have the authorities in the United Kingdom and the United States, we understand China is not a democratic state, right? But if we look at the authorities in the United Kingdom, the United States, why, and I really, if there's anyone here, have you not gone after HSBC? They have broken your deferred prosecution agreement. You'd be able to rake in billions of, effectively in fines, billions of dollars. You could prosecute the executives of HSBC, and you said you'd protect me from the slaps in case they come my way. But effectively, we see that nothing is done. And so when we have, despite the intentions of good people in South Africa, good prosecutors who are trying to do their job every day, when there isn't the momentum to ensure effective prosecutions in countries that have come out of a fight, a 14-round fight on state capture, right? This institution has been battered. We can reasonably expect, I want justice in Africa, but we can reasonably expect that the countries where those corporations are based will stop it happening next time in Peru or Tanzania or Sri Lanka or Guatemala, and we're not seeing that happening. And that is the crisis of impunity.
Mm-hmm. And it's the network. We have 11 and a half minutes left. So a couple of questions. I think there's a microphone in the house. Why don't we take, I see 1, 2, 3. Let's start with 3. One there, and one there. And then we'll see where we are on time.
Hi, my name's Angie.
Could you please introduce yourself? Yeah. And that would be great.
My name's Angie Stiller. I'm a youth advocate from Lebanon.
Slowly. Yeah,
it's time constraints applies to everyone. I'm a youth advocate from Lebanon. I'm in utter shock how Lebanon is not on this stage, because genuinely state capture seems to be like this next level of corruption that is extremely ambiguous. It's like we're using this term state capture merely to validate how bad the situation is for so many countries that are struggling with corruption to that degree. it is not normal how much I can relate from a Lebanese perspective to everything that was said. If there was a checklist of symptoms for what constitutes state capture, I would be checking so many of them, as with so many countries struggling with corruption today. And I would add, like, there were the pillars like justice, police. In Lebanon, there's also state capture for health, even of the banking sector. And I'm sure a lot of people here heard about the Ponzi scheme that happened. So it's like in Lebanon, the resolution here is to rewrite bureaucracy to begin with. It's to annihilate the old traditional powers to begin with. And it is to the very, very basics, going back to accountability and transparency. That's why, honestly, state capture is not such a tangible term to use, because our answer for reversing state capture is to attend this conference all over again and to just start back from the basics. So my question practically is, when we see that state capture is about enablement at its very core and the lack of accountability and the lack of transparency, my question is, why don't we establish indicators for when state capture is starting to happen, noting that state capture is none other than another drastic level of corruption and its manifestation in a country? And why don't we hold those to account, those who neglect those indicators, whether it was the enablers within the country, and in Lebanon, all the citizens are guilty of being enablers, but also the international community. How can we hold all of these, even the population, even the international community, anybody who is an enabler, according to those honest indicators? Thank you.
One there, a gentleman in blue, and then a lady in front.
Thanks. James Bolton-Jones from the UK-based NGO Spotlight on Corruption. So lots of people will be aware that in, I think, at least 3 of the countries that have been the subject of this discussion, countries like the US, UK, Canada have imposed sanctions. So, for example, on the Attorney General in Guatemala, or the Gupta brothers, or the Rajapaksa's by the Canadians. How useful do panelists think these sanctions were in these specific cases, and maybe more broadly in cases of state capture?
Hello, my name is Luciana Torchiaro. I'm regional advisor from Latin America from Transparency International. I have a question for Edis. Considering that the public ministry is still a threat to democracy in your country, and that is a unique opportunity at the moment, what actions is this government thinking? What actions can you take to remove this person from government? And would you consider any action an attack to democracy?
So there's one directed question, and then the other 2, I'd love anyone to take a swing at them. Would you like to take the Guatemala question, Eddie?
No, it's hard, I think, because...
Did everyone hear it? It's about removing senior military officials, right?
Public ministers, the general attorney.
Ministers.
Yes, Consuelo Porras. Is a famous, Consuelo Porras is his name of the general attorney in Guatemala.
The attorney general.
Anti-democratic general attorney is in fame on the world.
Right.
But she is still in
right.
position.
So the question is, this guy we've been talking about, how do you get rid of him?
I think in Guatemala, the legal frame or the constitutional law give us the answer. I think is the political, how I say, voluntad.
Political will.
Yes.
On the part of the current government?
Yes, and in the government we are analyzing what is the way and the constitutional way, the respect of the debido proceso, how I say,
due process.
Due process. And I think in Guatemala, we don't have a rule of law. It's a political of law, or how I say, it's another concept, because the rule of law don't exist in Guatemala. And I think it's a political decision we have to take on the government. For example, in my position in the Commission of Open and Electronic Government, we are working to democratize the fight against corruption. And we are working with the indigenous communities because they are aware to fight against corruption. The political decision is
I think what you're saying is that being reform-minded isn't enough in a reform government. You have to have cojones.
Yes.
Something like that. You know, you have to actually take these people on. Now we have, for the other two, sanctions and Lebanon.
Can I jump in on sanctions, if I may? Just briefly, you have to have cojones, as you say. And, you know, I mean, I guess I would start, my starting premise would be, you know, the sanctions are really helpful, but when you have the folks who really are the architects of the crime down the road in London and nothing's happening, then you don't have the cojones, right? And that's the problem in a country like the United Kingdom. However, having said that, I do think it's really important that we cut off the access that these networks have to privilege. Our dilemma as in the international community is that the United Kingdom is the old world, the United Arab Emirates is the new world. And, you know, you're no longer as shiny a thing as that which is being built there in the desert. And I think we need to recognize an autocratic regime with very few controls, where you can live a fantasy world sort of in this gilded cage, is the one that the Guptas and others really have opted for in South Africa. So unless those sanctions are really concerted across jurisdictions, and you know, I mean, I think we applaud the position of the United Kingdom government in a South African you know, circumstance, but I think the story in South Africa is one across across many countries in the region I come from, is that you can close that door, the United Kingdom, for example, but you know, there are other exciting opportunities, and where there is real encouragement of financial crime, of economic crime, like the UAE and others. And until we wrestle with that, I think we're just kind of running around and moving pieces around the board without stopping it.
Can I ask you two to field Lebanon?
Well, I'm not sure if I understood the question about indicators. About indicators?
Yeah. That's it. Could there be some kind? You know, we have a lot of measures. We've got, you know, corruption index.
We don't have state capture index.
We don't have a state capture or state capture
because it's very complex, unfortunately. So I am afraid that we won't build something like this.
But I think it's possible, and I know there is a publication that was done by IRI about 2 years back with research from our region, which was called the Kleptocrats Playbook. I think it would be on the web. You can probably download it.
The what? Playbook?
Kleptocrats Playbook.
Kleptocrats Playbook.
And I think the purpose, as I understood you, is a preventive angle, right? So when you start seeing some of these, you know, it's when you need to start acting before you go to the ultimate spot where, like, some of us or even your country is in. And I think for state capture, as you can see, there were so many commonalities, and they have their usual way, the tactics. And in fact, just over lunch, I mean, we were like discussing, I mean, our presidents, are they taking notes from each other? And I was like, I hope no, because it's just the same agenda, even how they treat civil society, even the kind of laws. And when we criticized the Online Safety Act, our government quoted some non-democratic countries and said they had similar laws which helped them to achieve economic recovery by keeping the mouth closed, kind of thing, of critiques. But I think an organization like TI, I mean, if we can't get together and put down some of these indicators, it won't be perfect. And with technology and, you know, and they're always ahead of us, the corrupt actors, things will get, it has to be a living document. But I'm sure with what we've learned so far, we can have some indicators, spread this knowledge, at least among anti-corruption actors, so that you can identify the symptoms. And also we can share some of the tried and tested possibilities of resistance. And then I think we need to do that. It's becoming way too common.
The issue, I'm going to have to stop us now.
Very quickly, I think there is one tool developed by Transparency International, National Integrity System.
We really can't. So,
this is a good tool to measure how the state is.
National
Integrity System. Very nice concept.
Just before we break up, I can't let us leave without a word to Gillian Dell and Lydia Prokic, who organized this with, I mean, really assiduously organized this, and anything that was awkward or any hiccups were my fault, not their fault. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here.